Imagine your phone buzzes. It's not a text, it's a bank alert. A deposit of NT $10,000. You didn't get a bonus, you didn't win the lottery, the government just sent it to you. For 23.6 million people in Taiwan, this is about to be a reality. It's the second time this has happened, and this time it's the biggest payout yet. But this isn't some planned celebration of economic success.
Yeah, not at all.
This NT $10,000 payment is the final move in a brutal political chess match. It started when the opposition party pointed to a staggering NT $1.8 trillion tax surplus and demanded the government give it back.
Right, that specific phrase, give it back.
The ruling party initially refused, calling it irresponsible, warning it would drive up debt. Then they lost a major political battle. Suddenly, that irresponsible idea became a priority.
A very high priority, seemingly overnight.
The government found the money, wrapped it in a new law citing international tensions and U.S. tariffs, and hit send. This isn't just a stimulus check, it's a political white flag.
That's a good way to put it.
And it's left everyone asking a strange new question. What happens when tax rebates become a political weapon?
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a massive policy reversal. The cabinet had initially, outright rejected this idea. They fought it. They warned about government borrowing. They even threatened a constitutional crisis.
They really did.
Yet here we are, preparing for the cash transfer. So what were the specific political dynamics that, broke the government's will and turned an irresponsible idea into a cabinet initiative? It's truly quite the spectacular flip-flop.
Well, this story is fundamentally about accountability and maybe even more importantly, political survival in what is a deeply competitive democracy.
Okay.
When a government collects revenue that significantly exceeds its budget projections, and we're talking about a record high over collection here, right? The Ministry of Finance data showed an excess of NT $528.3 billion just for the previous year alone.
Wow.
That kind of money. It immediately becomes political capital.
Yeah.
And the opposition, they seized that precise moment of fiscal revelation, and the pressure came from a unified opposition front, right? For our listeners who maybe don't follow Taiwanese domestic politics day to day, could you just clarify who's driving this and what that NT $1.8 trillion figure actually represents in real terms?
Sure. So the drive for this universal NT $10,000 cash handout was strategically spearheaded by the opposition bloc. That's principally the Kuomintang, the KMT.
Right.
And the smaller but still influential Taiwan People's Party, the TPP.
Okay.
Their argument was remarkably simple, which honestly is what made it so politically potent. They basically said, look, the government amassed a staggering NT $1.8 trillion in tax surplus from 2021 to the previous year.
A huge number.
Huge. To put that in perspective, NT $1.8 trillion is roughly, US $60 billion?
Yeah.
It's a monumental amount of money. And the opposition's line was simply, this money must be returned to the people immediately.
That framing, return to the people, it's brilliant, isn't it? Regardless of whether the money was actually, available like that. And the timing couldn't have been worse for the ruling party.
Exactly. That's the key. This demand for the handout, it was raised just before a major political battle known as the Great Recall elections.
Ah, okay.
And the opposition, the KMT and TPP, they ultimately won those high-stakes recalls.
Yeah.
That victory didn't just give them political momentum, it gave them undeniable leverage.
Right.
They effectively linked the public's perception of government overcollection, that massive NT $1.8 trillion figure, to their own electoral success. It made the government's refusal look like they were deliberately hoarding public wealth. It was, frankly, a perfect piece of political theater using a fiscal fact, or maybe a fiscal interpretation,
right,
to create a winning political narrative.
Yet the ruling party, the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, they didn't just roll over immediately. They pushed back hard, didn't they? They argued that NT $1.8 trillion was a mirage. It wasn't some pile of unallocated gold just sitting there. Why was the term surplus so misleading, and what were the government's legitimate financial counterarguments?
Well, the executive yuan, the cabinet, initially rejected the measure flat out. They cited genuine concerns about what they called fiscal irresponsibility.
Okay.
They argued that forcing a universal cash handout would compel the government to drive up the national debt. Their critical point was that the vast majority of that NT $1.8 trillion surplus was actually already allocated or legally earmarked. It wasn't leftover cash.
So it wasn't extra money?
Not according to them, no. They clarified that after all the existing commitments were met, only about NT $443.6 billion actually remained unspent, which is still a lot, but
A significant drop from the opposition's headline number. Yeah.
absolutely a huge drop.
So let's go through that breakdown because
Right.
it's pretty essential for understanding the fiscal reality versus the political rhetoric. Where did the bulk of that money actually go, according to the government?
Yeah, the government provided a very detailed and I think necessary breakdown. They said almost $900 billion was already set aside for debt repayment, which is, a key fiscal responsibility.
Sure.
Then another $307.9 billion was allocated to the necessary post-COVID recovery plan.
Okay, also important.
Right. Another $280.4 billion was legally due to local governments as part of revenue sharing agreements. And $195.7 billion was earmarked for various legally established special funds.
So when you add all that up,
When you sum those figures, the ruling party's position seemed pretty robust. Distributing $10,000 to every single citizen required borrowing, because the money the opposition claimed was extra was in fact already assigned to critical national functions.
and beyond just the financial argument, this escalated, didn't it? It became a structural, almost legal crisis regarding who holds the purse strings in Taiwan's government. They raised a massive constitutional red flag.
They absolutely did, and this is where the policy fight turned into, a battle over the fundamental structure of government power. The executive yuan, the cabinet, actually threatened to take the legislative yuan, that's the unicameral legislature, directly to the Constitutional Court.
Wow, that's serious.
Extremely serious. Their legal argument was profound. Taiwan's system, like many democracies, relies on a separation of powers. The executive branch initiates budgetary measures, and the legislative branch reviews and approves them.
Standard procedure.
Right. But if the legislature can unilaterally dictate entirely new, massive spending measures like this, it effectively usurps the executive's power. The ruling party called the opposition's measure potentially unconstitutional and illegal because it bypassed the proper executive budgetary drafting process. It fundamentally blurred the lines of responsibility.
That's a huge threat. A constitutional challenge could have stopped the handout entirely, right? And set a massive precedent about legislative overreach. Why did the government ultimately back down from such a critical legal fight?
Well, that's the political calculus, isn't it? Because the political cost of winning a legal argument was probably deemed higher than the cost of funding a popular policy.
Yeah.
The threat never materialized because the administration ultimately realized, I think, that fighting the policy in court would be viewed by the public as fighting against giving them money. Simple as that.
Yeah, bad optics.
Terrible optics, especially after the political losses in the recall elections and facing a hostile legislative majority. The government basically conceded that adapting to the political reality was the only path to survival. They decided that political stability and mitigating public backlash were worth more than upholding that specific legal principle at that moment.
So the government performed a strategic retreat, essentially. They kept the cash handout, but cleverly reframed it and gave it a new legal life. How did they manage to neutralize the constitutional threat while still essentially passing the opposition's core policy?
They essentially co-opted the opposition's policy and gave it a powerful and maybe more defensible political spin. The executive yuan agreed to keep the cash handout provisions, but they made them constitutional by turning them into a cabinet initiative. And they did this under a specific, very broad piece of legislation. The Special Act for Strengthening Economic, Social, and National Security Resilience in response to international circumstances.
Right.
This was, you have to admit, a masterful piece of political maneuvering.
That title is a mouthful, definitely. But it does exactly what you said. It neutralizes the political risk by framing a simple cash handout as some kind of measure of national security resilience.
Precisely. They justified the massive budget by stating its purpose was to counter the negative impacts from severe international tensions, global trade disruptions, and specifically the threat of proposed U.S. tariffs.
Okay.
This reframing allowed them to present the policy not as a debt-funded handout, which they'd argued against,
Right.
but as a necessary national defense against external economic shocks. This gave the budget measure immediate political legitimacy that the earlier return the surplus argument perhaps lacked constitutionally.
And the price tag for this political compromise just kept going up during the negotiations, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The special budget ceiling was raised multiple times during this high-stakes negotiation process. The executive yuan's original proposal for the whole act was around $410 billion.
Okay.
The opposition's version pushed it up to $545 billion.
Wow.
And the final ceiling, the one passed by the legislative yuan, settled at a staggering $570 billion. That's about US $19 billion, with even the possibility of increasing it further to NT $590 billion if needed.
And out of that huge budget.
Out of this enormous budget, the universal NT $10,000 cash handout was the single biggest allocation.
Yeah.
It sucked up NT $235 billion of that total amount. This policy became a monumental financial commitment, forced almost entirely by political leverage. So if we were to summarize the first, maybe core takeaway here, it is that electoral success in a highly competitive democracy can grant the license to redefine what constitutes fiscally responsible spending. The opposition managed to convert a fiscal concept, this tax overcollection, into what became a non-negotiable political mandate. What's truly fascinating here, I think, is how public pressure turned what was essentially a fiscal accounting argument into a mandated political priority. It effectively forced the ruling party's hand and critically reshaped the national budget priorities in real time.
That leads directly into our next segment, doesn't it? Because this political maneuver wasn't just about initiating new spending. It was about shifting priorities within the existing budget framework. And that highlighted a really clear inter-party conflict over what constitutes a national interest, especially when it came to state enterprises.
Yes, the sharpest and probably most revealing example of this inter-party conflict was the fate of the proposed NT $100 billion subsidy for Taiwan Power Company, or Taipower.
Right.
The KMT and TPP, wielding their legislative majority, deliberately scrapped that massive subsidy. We're talking over US $3.3 billion, specifically to free up funds for the universal cash handout instead.
Wait, they cut over $100 billion from the state utility company to pay for the handout. Why was cutting the Taipower subsidy such a critical point of conflict? And why did the ruling party see this as, sacrificing long-term national interests?
Because Taipower is far more than just a utility company in Taiwan. It's seen as a critical piece of national infrastructure and even national security.
Okay.
It's been facing severe financial issues, particularly related to the rising cost of imported fossil fuels globally, and also the pressures of the ongoing energy transition. It desperately needs financial stability to function properly, to strengthen its grid against both natural and, frankly, geopolitical threats, and to modernize its infrastructure.
So the ruling party's argument was?
The ruling party argued that by cutting this vital subsidy, the opposition was directly sabotaging long-term industrial stability. And critically, they warned it could force an increase in electricity rates and commodity prices down the line, which would disproportionately hurt manufacturers and economically vulnerable groups.
So we have a clear zero-sum conflict here. The opposition chose short-term political gain cash in people's hands now over what the government saw as long-term energy security and price stability.
Absolutely. The ruling party framed it exactly like that, as an act of fiscal recklessness. One perspective definitely saw the opposition's move as a blatant misuse of public funds just to seek immediate popular support and please voters, especially with, elections always seeming to be on the horizon.
Right.
This specific trade-off, sacrificing grid stability for a cash payment, was really highlighted as undermining genuine national interests and ignoring the fiscal discipline needed for structural maintenance. It underscored a key ideological split. One side prioritizing immediate public satisfaction, the other prioritizing longer-term structural resilience.
And it sets a potentially dangerous precedent, doesn't it? Implying that crucial infrastructure funding is somehow fungible with direct voter payments.
It does. It sends a signal that, in a political crunch, the immediate payoff of a direct cash transfer is valued more highly than the necessary but often unglamorous long-term maintenance of the power grid or the stabilization of a critical state entity. This kind of trade-off is often invisible to the average voter in the short term, but the long-term cost can be very, very real.
Okay, let's shift perspective a bit to how the average person on the street views these maneuvers. We've established the political machinations, but what's the public feeling? We have that great anecdote you mentioned earlier, the small noodle shop owner in Kaohsiung. What did she have to say about the handout?
Yeah, her perspective is highly valuable because it just cuts through all the political rhetoric with, pure common sense.
Yeah.
She viewed the handout not through the lens of sound economic policy or some selfless sharing of economic fruits,
Right.
but purely as a cynical political strategy driven by fear. She recognized that the government was giving out money simply because they were scared of losing votes. Her quote was very telling. An election is always on the horizon. This demonstrates a kind of widespread, maybe unspoken cynicism among the public. They'll accept the money, sure, but they recognize the motivation is likely political self-preservation, not necessarily fiscal excellence.
But despite that cynicism about the motives, these handouts clearly do have a positive public reception, don't they? As evidenced by the earlier NT $6,000 payout.
That's the paradox of democracy, isn't it? The previous NT $6,000 cash rebate back in 2023 showed strong, quantifiable public acceptance. A poll conducted afterwards indicated that a large majority, something like 73% of Taiwanese adults, found the cash handout helpful for their livelihood.
So people appreciate the money, regardless of the politics.
Exactly. Regardless of the political drama that precedes it, getting immediate cash relief, especially in a time of global economic anxiety, is going to be widely appreciated by most people.
And there's hard data confirming these measures provide a political lifeline, even if it's only temporary, to the ruling party.
Yes, absolutely. That earlier NT $6,000 payout, combined with some high-profile diplomatic events around the same time, measurably contributed to a small but important boost in the president's approval ratings.
Yeah. Okay.
This was pretty crucial for the administration in recovering some popularity after a damaging local election defeat they'd suffered. It clearly highlights the significant short-term political utility of these kinds of policies.
That's only short-term.
Well, experts are quick to note that while these policies offer immediate appeal, they rarely translate into stable, long-term electoral support. They tend to function more like pragmatic, transient benefits for the voter, basically.
Yeah.
A quick favor that's appreciated in the moment,
Right.
but it's quickly forgotten when the next long-term structural issue or political scandal arises.
So it's like a shot of electoral adrenaline, maybe, but not something that changes the political patient's long-term health.
Precisely. That's a good analogy. It might reset the clock on public goodwill for a short while, but it doesn't actually solve the underlying policy problems that often lead to electoral defeats in the first place.
Okay, so once you execute a policy like this twice, you definitely create an expectation, right? We've already seen some lawmakers suggesting that this return to the people idea should become a regular, institutionalized policy like a fixed event on the national calendar.
This is the inevitable next step, isn't it? And it represents a genuine potential danger to long-term public finance. You have lawmakers now openly arguing for making universal cash handouts a regular policy.
And they're citing examples.
Yes, they're citing regional success stories or perceived success stories like Macau, Hong Kong, and Singapore, which often do provide similar public transfers based on their generally high fiscal health. They essentially want to codify this political expediency into law.
But the executive yuan has strongly resisted this institutionalization idea, going back to the fundamental definition of what a surplus actually is. Can you re-explain the government's core argument against making this a regular thing?
Yeah, their argument is crucial and often gets lost in the political noise. They reject the notion that a tax surplus represents actual available extra income just lying around.
Okay.
They emphasize it is merely the difference between the government's budgeted estimates of tax revenue and the amount that was actually collected in a given year. In an economy like Taiwan's, which is heavily reliant on unpredictable global exports and commodity prices, that difference provides absolutely essential fiscal flexibility.
And if you institutionalize the handout, you basically lose that flexibility entirely.
Correct. Hard-coding that money for specific recurring purposes like a universal cash handout would severely erode the government's ability to respond to immediate, unpredictable national needs.
Like what, for example?
Well, think about sudden natural disasters, an unforeseen but necessary surge in defense spending, or a sudden global economic shock that requires immediate capital deployment. Institutionalizing the handout forces the government to lock up funds that could otherwise be reserved for those necessary but unscheduled expenditures. It effectively creates a rigid budget structure that's really ill-suited to managing the volatility of a globally exposed economy.
So institutionalizing the handout basically means institutionalizing the borrowing that might be needed to fund it, essentially.
Pretty much. Because if the tax collection estimate is off in the other direction one year, or if major unexpected costs arise, the government would still be politically obligated to pay out the handout. That would force them into deficit spending for a politically mandated purpose, rather than for a necessary investment or emergency response. That sounds like a recipe for long-term fiscal instability.
Okay. Let's move past the politics for a moment and dig into the economics. What does this massive influx of cash actually do for Taiwan's highly export-dependent economy, especially when it's facing these severe global headwinds and the looming threat of U.S. tariffs? Does a cash handout actually fix the problems the Special Act was supposedly created to address?
Yeah, this raises the most important economic question here. Is a universal handout the right tool for an economy that's primarily facing structural export challenges? Or is it just applying a domestic consumption solution to what is fundamentally a global trade problem? And the economic backdrop against which this handout is being released is, frankly, quite sobering.
Taiwan's economy is uniquely exposed to external demand, isn't it? Especially in that high-tech sector. And the data confirms the severity of the slowdown.
It's more than just a slowdown. The nation actually experienced a technical recession.
Right, 2 negative quarters.
Exactly. Defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. This started in Q4 of the previous year with a contraction of negative 0.86% year-on-year. That was followed by an even sharper, more alarming decline of negative 3.02% year-on-year in Q1 of the current year.
Wow, minus 3%.
Yeah. That Q1 decline was actually the largest the country had seen since the second quarter of 2009, which was right in the peak of the global financial crisis.
And that level of recessionary pressure is a direct mirror of global monetary policy shifts, mainly the U.S. Fed raising rates.
Precisely. The primary driver of this technical recession was the aggressive central bank monetary tightening, led mainly by the U.S. Federal Reserve. As global interest rates climbed really steeply to try and quell persistent multi-decade high inflation, global demand just cooled dramatically.
And Taiwan feels that directly.
Instantly. Because Taiwan's economy is so dependent on selling goods overseas, microchips, electronics, components, when global buyers stop spending, Taiwan feels the pain instantly and profoundly.
And the bellwether for the entire economy, the semiconductor sector, which had been the great supporter during the recent tech boom, is even showing significant vulnerability now.
Yes. Even key global players, including Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Co., TSMC, were projecting slight revenue declines for the year. This was due to weaker order intake globally and the need for their customers to adjust these massive inventories they built up.
Okay.
The performance of this electronics and semiconductor sector really holds the ultimate key to Taiwan's broader economic outlook. Economists are cautioning that overall GDP growth may struggle significantly just to stay above 2% this year, even with this domestic stimulus applied.
Which brings us back to that inherent mismatch you mentioned. The political justification for the cash handout was the Special Act, which explicitly aims to counter the impact of international circumstances, like U.S. tariffs.
Right, and the irony is, as you said, pretty stark. The legislation was passed under the looming threat of U.S. reciprocal tariffs, which were proposed to be steep, maybe between 20% to 50%, affecting Taiwanese products estimated at around U.S. $30 billion. That's about 26% of total U.S. imports from Taiwan. These tariffs hit very specific export-oriented sectors.
So, okay, let's make it concrete. If my metal component factory in Tainan is facing a potential 50% tariff from the U.S. on its exports, how does giving NT $10,000 to every citizen, including me and my employees, actually address that problem?
Well, structurally, it doesn't really. Economists consistently highlight this exact conflict. The domestic cash handout primarily targets boosting domestic consumption. People buying food, clothing, maybe going out to eat, getting services locally.
All right, things inside Taiwan.
Exactly. However, the severe economic stress that the legislation is supposedly responding to is concentrated almost entirely in export-oriented industries and traditional manufacturing sectors that are facing weak global demand and those specific potential tariffs.
Let's use that anecdotal contrast we talked about earlier to illustrate the difference between the domestic sugar rush and the export reality.
Okay. Take the two scenarios. On one hand, you have, say, the night market restaurant owner or the local retail shop. They probably see an immediate, maybe even thriving boost in domestic spending. People have a little extra cash, so maybe they eat out more often or purchase some non-essential items. Their revenue likely increases.
Makes sense.
But then you look at the manager of that metal component factory you mentioned. Let's say his export orders are down 40% because of the global market contraction and the tariff uncertainty. While his employees might spend their NP $10,000 at the local night market,
right,
that domestic cash infusion generates absolutely zero new international orders for his factory. His structural problem remains completely untouched by the handout.
So it's misaligned. It
seems misaligned, yes. The cash handout provides maybe a sugar rush to the domestic service sector, which might already be performing relatively better, while the deeply recessed export manufacturing sector continues to struggle. It's a potential misalignment of stimulus and actual economic need.
The government, though, defends the policy based on the idea of a multiplier effect, right? Arguing that the total spending generated will be greater than the initial NT $235 billion outlay. What is their quantitative estimate for the contribution to GDP growth?
Yeah, they do lean on that multiplier argument. The total handout of NT $235 billion is estimated by a government agency to contribute about 0.415 percentage points to overall GDP growth for the year,
Okay, almost 0.5%.
which follows a precedent of the earlier NT $6,000 handout, which
Yeah.
they estimated contributed around 0.3 percentage points. In a low-growth environment, adding nearly half a percentage point sounds potentially significant and, politically defendable.
But the core risk that economists keep raising is substitution. This is where the effectiveness of the stimulus check kind of leaks out, right? What does substitution look like in the average household, and why does it severely limit the actual economic benefit?
Substitution is a key concern, yes. It's basically when the cash handout isn't used for new economic activity, but rather replaces money the household was already planning to spend anyway.
For example?
For example, if a family was going to pay their utility bill or their rent this month regardless, and they just use the NT $10,000 for that existing expense, then the economy sees zero net new consumption from that portion.
Okay.
We're still in times of high economic instability and anxiety, like when people fear recession or potential job loss. Households naturally prioritize financial security. They might use the cash for debt repayment or simply put it straight into savings or maybe some low-risk investment account.
Taking it out of the spending cycle?
Yeah, exactly. Removing it from the immediate consumption cycle entirely. If they save the money, the desired multiplier effect collapses.
Yeah.
The government has essentially paid for existing consumption or increased household savings rather than generating fresh economic demand.
Do we have specific data on how recipients actually plan to use this NT $10,000 data that might confirm that substitution risk?
We do, and the data seems to highlight these exact concerns. A poll indicated that while the largest single portion, about 33.7%, plan to use the NT $10,000 for immediate daily consumption.
Okay, that's the stimulus part.
That's the intended stimulus part, yes. But a very significant combined percentage was allocated to non-stimulative uses. 19% planned just for savings, and another 14.1% planned for investment.
Wow, so add those up.
When you combine the savings and investment portions, that's over 33% of the money. A full third of the entire NT $235 billion package is essentially leaked out of the immediate consumption multiplier cycle, according to those intentions. That substantially limits the policy's economic efficiency.
And this is precisely why, in the past, the government has specifically avoided cash payments and used things like non-cash consumption vouchers, right?
Yeah, exactly. Policies like the NT $3,600 vouchers back in 2009 or the more recent triple-quintuple vouchers during the COVID era were deliberately designed to be non-cash. They often had expiration dates,
Right,
too.
forcing you to spend them.
Precisely. Forcing people to spend the money within a defined period and maximizing the consumption stimulus effect. The political choice to shift back to universal cash payments definitely maximizes political popularity and the ease of delivery, no question. But it inherently increases the fiscal risk of substitution, making the economic outcome less predictable and potentially less efficient. It's that classic trade-off between political expediency and economic rigor. And, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the most profound impact of this politically necessary handout might not actually be on this quarter's small GDP bump, but rather on the future balance sheet of the nation. This raises really fundamental questions about long-term fiscal stability and, frankly, the moral hazard of intergenerational responsibility.
It sounds like the NT $10,000 isn't just a symbol of political surrender, maybe, but a tangible manifestation of a deeper fiscal challenge regarding how Taiwan manages its high revenue collection alongside these rising long-term commitments.
That is absolutely the crux of the issue. Despite all the political rhetoric about returning the surplus, the actual implementation of this NT $10,000 handout requires the government to issue a significant amount of new debt.
How much?
Specifically, NT $101.4 billion, which is roughly US $3.45 billion in new borrowing.
So it's not paid for by the surplus.
It means the spending is, in fact, being funded by borrowing money and adding to the national debt, not by spending some leftover cash that was just sitting there.
And this borrowing attracted immediate and pretty harsh criticism from the academic community, didn't it? People who argued that debt reduction should have been the priority instead.
Oh, absolutely. Scholars were quick to label this move as unnecessary and inefficient government expenditure expansion.
Ouch.
Their argument was that prioritizing debt reduction would have been the fiscally prudent choice. Reducing the national debt lowers the government's future interest expenditures on the current NT $5.39 trillion central government debt, which, by the way, is expected to rise to NT $6.01 trillion soon.
And lower interest payments mean?
Lowering those interest payments frees up permanent recurring resources, money that could then be channeled into long-term, arguably non-political investments like infrastructure, education, social welfare, all things that enhance national competitiveness for generations to come.
So the handout is criticized as a kind of temporary financial fix that distracts from making needed structural financial improvements.
Exactly. One expert critically labeled the entire NT $235 billion expenditure as being akin to a brief summer shower.
A summer shower.
Yeah. It might momentarily cool things down and create a temporary fluctuation, but it causes no lasting change to the overall economic structure. Worse, by expanding government expenditure through borrowing for what is essentially non-productive consumption, there's a real risk of contributing to localized inflation or potentially even financial market bubbles without providing any sustained, real benefit to the underlying economy. It's the fundamental difference between investing in a tool that creates future wealth and simply consuming a resource right now.
And when you borrow to fund a consumption event like this, the resource gets used up, but the debt remains behind.
Precisely. And that debt then becomes a permanent claim against future government revenue.
Which leads directly to the next point. When a government borrows to fund immediate popularity to satisfy today's voters, the real cost gets transferred directly to the next generation. That's the core of the intergenerational equity crisis, isn't it?
It is the central moral hazard embedded within this kind of policy decision. Utilizing current tax overcollections, even if they were genuine, unallocated surpluses, for immediate cash handouts already compromises the capability for long-term national construction.
But this is borrowing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when the government actually borrows money to fund the handout, it becomes concrete debt left to future generations. This borrowing effectively ignores massive potential future risks that those younger generations will inevitably have to face, such as the monumental costs associated with the national energy transition, or the politically sensitive but necessary task of sustaining financially struggling state enterprises like Taipower over the long haul.
How does this abstract fiscal concept translate into genuine, day-to-day anxiety for younger citizens in Taiwan?
Well, I think the anecdote of the young couple, Yi Chun and Wei, illustrates this perfectly. They're in their late 20s, just started a family. When they heard about the NT $10,000 handout, about US $330, Yi Chun apparently felt immediate, practical relief. That money could genuinely cover months of formula and diapers for their new baby.
Understandable.
Very understandable. But Wei, who works in finance, expressed a deep, almost sinking feeling. He saw the money not as a gift, but as an invisible IOU. He worried that this immediate cash benefit was essentially a loan taken from their own long-term and their child's fiscal security. This anxiety is often tied directly to systemic issues, like the national pension system, which is widely projected to face bankruptcy before Wei and Yi Chun even reach retirement age.
So they see a direct link.
For them, the feeling is the government is literally weakening the social safety net that they will rely on in the future in exchange for providing a temporary benefit today.
So they feel the handout is kind of cannibalizing their own future financial security.
Exactly. It makes the trade-off incredibly tangible. If the government had borrowed that NT $100 billion to build a high-speed rail extension or a new research center, it would be creating a permanent asset that future generations could benefit from.
Right.
Borrowing to provide consumption cash creates zero lasting asset. It just leaves the debt behind. This makes the erosion of intergenerational equity seem particularly egregious in the eyes of many fiscal watchdogs.
Now, the political desire to make this return to the people idea routine often points to regional models, right? Suggesting Taiwan should emulate places like Hong Kong, Macau, and Singapore, which do routinely provide cash or benefits to their citizens.
Yes, this comparison is very pervasive in the political discourse because it allows the opposition or proponents of the policy to claim Taiwan is just joining the league of advanced, prosperous Asian economies. But it fundamentally misses a crucial material distinction.
What's the key difference?
Experts consistently stress that the similar distribution policies in Hong Kong, Macau, and Singapore are based on crystal clear, genuine fiscal surpluses and historically robust financial health. They have massive sovereign wealth funds or years and years of structural budget surpluses. They are truly giving away extra money that they legitimately have on hand.
And Taiwan's financial reality is fundamentally different from that.
It is. Taiwan's situation, despite having moments of high tax collection, is characterized structurally by a rising national debt balance. This means that, overall, government revenue is often insufficient to cover all long-term expenditures and future commitments. Issuing cash in this scenario means actively borrowing money and piling onto the long-term debt burden.
So it's not the same situation at all.
It fundamentally contrasts with the sound financial premises of its neighbors. Trying to adopt a surplus sharing policy without actually having a genuine structural surplus is fiscally precarious. It's like imitation without the necessary foundation.
And the political precedent set here, this expectation that any revenue upside, perceived or real, must immediately be converted into visible cash benefits, that seems like the most lasting legacy of this whole political battle.
It truly is. The public now has a confirmed, politically reinforced expectation that any perceived revenue upside must be immediately converted into highly visible, universal cash benefits. That political expectation has now even been codified into law via this special act.
Making it harder to reverse.
Exactly, making it exponentially difficult for any future government, regardless of which party is in power, to resist this demand or even to argue for reserving those funds for vital things like debt repayment, long-term national security priorities, or essential but maybe less popular infrastructure investments. The weaponization of the tax surplus, as you called it earlier, fundamentally changes the fiscal calculus of Taiwanese politics, potentially forever.
So, summing up our deep dive today, we have seen how a staggering tax overcollection was seized upon by political opponents, forcing the ruling party into executing a massive policy reversal. They retreated from a potential constitutional challenge and ended up adopting a policy they had vehemently opposed just months earlier. What started as a dispute over fiscal management quickly became a highly effective political tool. The result is this NT $10,000 cash handout that, yes, will offer a necessary boost to some domestic consumption.
Right, some short-term help there.
But arguably fails to address the deep structural challenges facing Taiwan's vital export-oriented economy, especially amidst global trade tensions and a recent technical recession. Ultimately, we've found ourselves in a situation where the immediate relief of cash in hand for 23.6 million people comes wrapped in a really complex fiscal trade-off. It creates NT $101.4 billion in new debt that will be serviced not by today's supposed surplus, but by tomorrow's taxpayers.
Yeah, I think the core lesson here is that in a highly competitive democracy like Taiwan's, the line between fiscal prudence and political necessity can become extremely thin. And in this case, political necessity clearly won out, setting a very powerful precedent. This whole episode demonstrates that the public, or at least a vocal part of it mobilized by the opposition, now expects to share immediately in any perceived economic upside, regardless of the underlying national debt levels or critical future systemic needs like energy infrastructure or pension stability. The political weaponization of temporary tax surpluses has fundamentally changed expectations around public finance. It's transformed what was once seen as maybe budgetary slack or fiscal flexibility into a permanent, highly visible demand that it seems must now be met to maintain political legitimacy.
And the provocative thought that leaves us with.
Well, it makes it exponentially harder for any future government to reserve funds for essential, but often politically unpopular, long-term national security and infrastructure investments. And that could potentially compromise the nation's long-term resilience, all for the sake of ensuring short-term political stability and voter satisfaction.